Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. So this is episode 29, and we're recording this on February 19th, 2023.
On this episode, I speak with Bonnie Glaser, who heads the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund. Our conversation is all about China as we discuss spy balloons, Taiwan, and the conditions that might spark China to risk war with the United States. We begin the show with the latest updates on the Russia-Ukraine war, with Ryan explaining the conspiracy theory that posits that the U.S. critically damaged the Nord Stream pipeline that brought gas from Russia into Germany. The current head of the World Bank unexpectedly resigned this week. We explain why he's leaving and why it matters. We also discuss the mission of the World Bank and why many want it to have a larger role in addressing the issue of climate change in developing countries. So, as always, I ask you, what's been going on in our lives?
So much pressure. Yeah, well, I figured I've had a very long hiatus of playing any video games. Even though I'm an avid listener of video game podcasts,
so
which I live vicariously through. But I did pick up, because you've been begging me, I picked up the Nintendo Switch, kind of our game platform of choice, and started playing Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. So Pokemon Scarlet. And yeah, I've been enjoying it. I'm probably only, 6 hours in at this point, but it's been fun. I mean, a lot of what people have complained about, like the graphics don't seem to have advanced in 20 years with Pokemon games. So it's a bit of a mystery on how that passes. But, they're able to sell these for $60 a pop. So I guess, there's not much incentive for improvement there. But I've been enjoying it. And, this is part of we're very into, people that know us, we're very into Pokemon. At least between kind of Pokemon Go, so the mobile app that kind of peaked in 2016, and
It started in 2016. How could it have peaked?
No, it totally peaked then. That's when it had the most users, and that's when it hit popular consciousness with Hillary's cringeworthy Pokemon Go to the polls.
Forgot about that.
And the famed 2016 train wreck election. But yeah, so I've been enjoying it. You've been giving me little pointers, but it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I needed you to play it so we could trade, because you can't get all the Pokemon unless you trade.
Right. But I think I'm probably need, another at least 20 or 30 hours in the game to have Pokemon worthy of trading. So that is penciled in for the upcoming India trip that we have coming up. Hopefully I'll be able to get in a little bit between all the flights and driving that we'll be doing. Get a little bit more Pokemon playtime in.
Yeah, so we've also been working on the final details for that. I've done a lot of last minute shopping for our trip.
A lot of shopping, yeah. I mean, we have to. I mean, it's just a lot of, our daughter needed clothes. We obviously needed, I think we talked about previously, the 3-day wedding festivities require quite a bit in terms of elaborate dress. So we had to get that nailed away. And then it's basically like going from a very mild winter here to essentially what's more or less the average temperature here in DC
in the summer.
In July. Yeah. So flying right into that, which I'm thankful for, because at least we're missing the 110 degree temperatures that are more endemic, I think, by May and June in India. So we're missing that, fortunately, but still going to be in the upper 80s. So a little bit hot.
Yeah, that sounds too hot, but I'm sure it'll be a great trip. And so, it's just been a whirlwind of doing the last minute activities. And now that we had our outfits, we had to get jewelry. And there's a lot that goes into these Indian weddings. It's very elaborate. There's a lot of things. But it's going to be exciting. I mean, I've always loved to look at Indian weddings, so I'm glad that we get to be part of one, even if it's been kind of complex.
It's a little complex. We still haven't done a whole lot of practicing for our Bollywood style dance, so we're really going to have to crack down on that these next 2 weeks.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Okay. So on with the main part of our show. And so we begin with our Russia-Ukraine war update. And you, Ryan, had some details you plan to talk about the latest going on in the actual fighting in the war before we get on to your beautiful conspiracy theory discussion.
Oh, yeah, the conspiracy. Before we get into that, we need to eat our vegetables and give brief update, just a brief update on the Russian offensive. So I think one of the big questions that has been portrayed in the media is like, okay, we've talked about this Russian offensive. What's exactly the nature of it? Is this what we're seeing since the late January? Is that it? Or is there something bigger pending? And, we're going to talk about a couple different articles. So the first one is just the New York Times, which had a piece this week reporting on the battle for Vuhledar, which is strategically probably more important than Bakhmut, which we discussed previously, because it intersects the Donetsk region, which is one of the provinces in the Donbass region, and then the Zaporizhzhia region to the south, which, of course, is the lifeline to Crimea and Russia's efforts there. And frankly, this whole battle, which occurred, I think, 2 weeks ago at this point, has been a real disaster. But it's seen as one of the first pushes by the Russian military. So according to the British Defense Intelligence Agency, the outcome from this 2-day battle is that 2 Russian brigades are in absolute tatters. So about 1,000 troops are dead, 130 armored vehicles lost, including 36 tanks. And it just seems like the Russian military is continuing to make similar mistakes that it did in the past. I mean, one, they announced this ahead on social media, I think in an attempt to demoralize Ukrainian forces, which seems like an odd choice. I mean, it seems like standard to the playbook, but not taking into account what they've encountered in the very high morale of the Ukraine forces. And then it also basically sent in, again, cannon fodder style, forces largely untrained, poorly led at this point into a anti-tank minefield without clearing it. So huge losses on their front. Obviously, there's a lot of fog of war, but a lot of this information is coming from Russian military bloggers and social media posts by the Wagner mercenaries. So again, they've been very highly critical specifically of this push in Vuhledar, that it's turned out so badly. And based on the forces, the Russian soldiers that have been captured, it's obvious that these are very recently mobilized troops, and includes prisoners as well that were recruited by the Wagner group. So at this point, UK and the US think that between 80 and 97% of Russia combat forces are committed to this. And I won't go into detail on this, the second item, but we'll have notes to the podcast. But Michael Kaufman and Nick Danforth in their podcast for War on the Rocks kind of detailed out the nature of the offensive, the fact that what we're seeing today, that's it. That's what Russia has the capacity for. The additional 100,000 in reserve that they have is basically just to, as they see losses on the front, these are just troops to replace that. But they don't have the capacity to wage offensive in the South, for instance. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of ways, the way that Kaufman kind of interprets it is that it could be a blessing that Russian forces kind of wear themselves out on this Eastern offensive, which is largely carried out for political purposes. And that gives Ukraine then the advantage in terms of being able to launch one, most likely in the South in the latter part of spring or summer. And Russia won't have those reserves essentially. To actually have 2 offenses, they would have to have a mobilization equal to what they've done already. So they would have to bring in another 300,000 troops. And there's no sign of that. That would be essentially kind of a full mobilization, full societal mobilization. And you just haven't seen that yet. So I think the other thing we wanted to point out for this week, again, going back on the end game, how does this war look? When is it going to end? What are the terms it's going to end in? And there's a very interesting piece that came out. It was an interview with a World War II historian, Stephen Kotkin. And we'll provide links to the article, but the point that I wanted to point out, and these are some of the quotes, but the idea at this point of the way that the war is shaping out is it's going to be a war of attrition. So Stephen in this interview says, in order to win a war of attrition, you have to outproduce and you have to crush your enemy's production. And he points out that, and this is something, Anita, I think, obviously you're very deeply vested in and as part of your role at the National Defense University, but there hasn't been that ramp up of industrial production. And he provides a case example where Ukrainians essentially are expending upwards of 90,000 artillery shells a month, but U.S. monthly production of those shells is only 15,000, and the rest of NATO is another 15,000. So you have this deficit of 60,000 shells. And then on the Russian side, we talked about in our last episode, the sanctions haven't necessarily been that effective, definitely not from a overall Russian economic performance, and maybe not from even a military side when we talk about core things like production of cruise missiles or production of artillery shells. So the crux of Kotkin's point is that how do you fight a war of attrition when you have your left hand tied behind your back? So essentially, you're not ramping up your own production, or rather, Ukraine depends on the West as a whole and their production. And then if you can't damage Russia's production, either through economic sanctions, which don't seem to be working, or by bombing these facilities, which Ukraine doesn't have the weapons or capacity to be able to do, where does that leave you?
Yeah, well, bombing their own capabilities would too much the possibility of leading to a wider war. So that's obviously not an option that you can pursue. And in that sense, I think your hand will continue to be tied behind your back. But the part of ramping up production is definitely something that we could be doing and probably should be doing. This is pure speculation from a military standpoint, is that not expecting the conflict to go as long and as intense as it is, making if we had resolved the war, they wouldn't have needed to have ramped up production. There is a huge problem, though, within the industrial base of limited production of many of our military equipment. And we talked a lot about in my classes about, well, what if we were to engage in a war with China, what about attrition then, and how inadequately we're prepared for it? It also takes a long time to ramp up production. So you wouldn't really even see a difference for 6 months to a year if you began today. A couple issues with it are going to be money. You're going to have to get money from Congress to be able to expand the industrial base. You can't just tell these companies, well, you need to be producing more munitions. You're going to have to pay for it. But you might also have to provide loans for building new factories. I mean, part of the problem is the consolidation of the defense industry, where they're running factories at capacity as it is. So either you get new companies involved or you figure ways to help current companies to expand. But it's not something that you can just turn the switch on and be able to do immediately. The discrepancy between what Ukraine is spending every month, the 90,000 shells, and only being able to produce 15,000 a month in the United States is worrisome, right? Because obviously you're drawing down your stockpiles. And it's not like we had huge stockpiles to begin with. And finally, there's the issue of China, right? These are all stockpiles that were meant to be there in case of a war with China. And attrition is likely to be a huge issue with that. And the one positive side, if you were able to ramp up your industrial base now, you would have that built-in capacity then. But that's pretty big decision-making on how likely you think that war is. Although it seems to me in the military, there is a growing consensus that we at least need to be prepared for that possibility because it seems very real.
Yeah. I mean, you would think something, given the focus on China, given the situation you're seeing around production capacity with Ukraine, you'd be able to get bipartisan support, you'd think, for something that's going to bring additional jobs. I mean, you're talking about building additional factories and things within the heartland for weapons manufacturing in order to build up that capacity. So you'd think you'd be able to get consensus, but I haven't seen anything actively, I mean, is there a bill in Congress that's focused on that? No, okay.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
The one thing we don't talk enough about is how to do these things politically. So you talk about what the military needs, what it's insufficient at, what it is sufficient at. We talked a lot about where the industrial base is now and how long it takes to ramp up production. Like in World War II, we had 1 or 2 years where we were building up our mobilization capacity before we entered the war, which made a huge difference because we contrasted to World War I, where we had to rely on European weapons because we couldn't build enough of our own fast enough. So there's a lot of complex issues at a strategic level, and then how to carry those out at a policy level. We really don't talk about that. And so I'm not even really sure where you begin, but it is something the military needs to be thinking more about. Because I think the big puzzle is, how do you expand the industrial base without direct war? All right, so I think it's an easy to read article. Historians have a way with words. And so I encourage everyone to maybe check that out if you're interested at all.
Yep.
All right, so for dessert, I guess, if you call it the first part vegetables, then...
This is following up on our little Hunter Biden escapade from a couple episodes ago.
Yeah. One of the differences in our personalities is Ryan gets very invested in learning about conspiracy theories.
Well, and I think that's the thing, especially I think in the new media landscape, the fact that you have such a fracturing of where people get their news from. It's really the golden age of conspiracy theories. I think that's why we wanted to highlight this one, because honestly, it hasn't been covered in what would be seen as the mainstream legacy media, which is primarily what, when we provide show notes, when we talk about things, that's that. I mean, and of course, that's dismissed by both fringes of the U.S. political system as unreliable news. But we think because it obeys and still sticks with journalistic standards, which we'll talk about a little bit in this allegations of the Nord Stream bombing. So that's why I think it's important to highlight, because whatever you believe, and just so let's start off with a little bit of background.
I just want to say something real fast and say that this particular story is something I've never come across. You told me about it. I haven't read it anywhere. And it is a little bit different than other conspiracy theories because we do hear about what the other side is saying about Hunter Biden and such.
We do after months and months. But I think what's unique about this story is this is the birth of a conspiracy theory, for sure. And this is going to likely linger for a while in certain circles. Because, Hunter Biden, that took months and years. That's been going on since at least 2017 as a conspiracy theory. Yeah. But to this day, millions of Americans think that the sole reason that the U.S. is invested in the Russia-Ukraine war is in order to cover up the dirty dealings that Hunter Biden did on behalf of the big guy, Joe Biden. That's real. Millions of people believe that. And that's the thing with these conspiracy theories. So let's take a step back. So the one that we're talking specifically about is a investigative journalist, Cy Hirsch, who is famed for his work during the Vietnam War. He was the one, when he was working for the New York Times and the New Yorker, uncovered the My Lai massacre that U.S. troops carried out in a Vietnam village. He also broke the Abu Ghraib torture story in Iraq. So both of these were cases where this journalist has a legacy. He's won a Pulitzer Prize. That being said, what he's done recently, both in reporting in Syria and then around bin Laden and the raid that U.S. troops carried out on bin Laden, have been basically just fabrications, poorly sourced, completely off. So you have this unique situation where people that maybe have an agenda for this to be true can point to the guy's reputation in the past, and has an excellent reputation in the far past, But the last 15 years has been getting deeper and deeper more into kind of this conspiracy theory. So what Cy Hirsch did, he published on Substack, which I've been noticing has become more and more of a legitimate forum for journalists to, or maybe not legitimate, but more common forum that you see.
Especially with Twitter, the degradation of how people feel like they can use Twitter and the quality of Twitter. You've seen a lot of them now will just link to their Substack articles, where before that might have been like a tweet chain or something like that.
Right. So yeah, it's interesting seeing Substack kind of used at this. So he publishes this article. Essentially, it alleges a conspiracy between the U.S. government and Norway to carry out the bombing of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which we talked about when it occurred last September. Now, to this day, in terms of the official outcome from the investigation, there hasn't been a lot of detail. I think Sweden and Denmark, which were carrying it out since it occurred in their territorial waters, they concluded that wasn't an accident, that was an act of sabotage, but there haven't been any additional details beyond that. And that's kind of one of the key things of what allows a conspiracy theory is the lack of communication for a long time, because this is I think they came out with this announcement in November or December, and essentially it's been radio silence since then. So the Cy Hirsch article hits. And what's interesting about it is, one, it provides a lot of detail. So it provides kind of a Tom Clancy novel level of detail, very well written from that aspect, very engaging. And it talks about the military operation, specifically the fact that it was Navy divers trained in Panama City, and that the bombing was carried out under the guise of a NATO exercise that in order to plant the bomb months ahead of time and then was triggered by a remote device. Now, all of this sounds really compelling, but there's several things. We'll provide a link. There's several people, and again, in this sort of informal media system, it hasn't been touched, frankly, by the mainstream media, which I think is one of the dangers and disservices. And that was raised, that entire point was raised by an ex-BBC correspondent by the name of Natalia Antalava. And she really talks about the danger of her colleagues basically dismissing it as bad journalism, which it is. It's a single source, a single anonymous source. It obviously failed to meet any sort of editorial review. That's why it's in Substack instead of the New York Times or the Washington Post. But when you leave it and there is a radio silence, there's already this great distrust of the media, especially within American society. If you look at approval ratings, you have like Congress probably on the bottom and then the US media maybe slightly above that. So there's a complete lack of trust. So when you have this ignoring what they view as a conspiracy theory, which is fine, it allows for other outlets. And because those other outlets have grown in size and influence so much, it spreads like wildfire. So she notes in her article that, not only is it being spread by Russian propagandists, you have this coalition of far American leftists and conservatives. In fact, it was featured, of course, on Tucker Carlson, who, again, he's the biggest audience on mainstream media. He said, there's so many details in here that it's not possible that it's not true. It's true. So you get that. You have Indian and Chinese outlets that have been readily spreading this as the truth. Edward Snowden, of course. And then you have seen within Europe some of the mainstream media, which essentially it doesn't cover it from we tried to validate these sources or validate this story. It's just a reaction to these articles. So people see this over and over, and it's just millions and millions of people. You look up this hashtag on Twitter, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of retweets, all from these far left and far right.
But okay, let's say for a minute that the mainstream media did cover the story, did mention it. Those same people are not going to believe the mainstream media. You already said.
Not at this point, because they ignored the original story.
Oh, because you think that they would have trusted it so much if they had.
Well, I think at least it would be challenged in the Google searches, because that's the other point that she raises, is because there's such a volume now being created around this conspiracy theory, and the fact that they can point to this guy's previous historical legitimacy, it just continues to grow and metastasize and whatnot. Now, what I think is probably happening, because this has gotten enough traction, you are going to have a serious piece. I would imagine there are several media outlets that are working on something that essentially discredits all of this. And that's what happened with his previous article. So his previous one, he alleged that during the Syrian war, he was actually very close, Hersh was very close with Bashar al-Assad.
So many strikes against.
So many, I know. But he essentially alleged during that time where there's chemical weapon usage by Syrian forces, he said that it was the rebel forces that were backed by the US. And then for bin Laden, it was this very elaborate conspiracy theory that he alleged between the US and Pakistani government, where essentially Pakistan had him all the time, knew about it, and kind of handed it over to U.S. forces. That wasn't part of a raid, wasn't part of that. But you had media outlets that came out, maybe a month or two later and essentially went line by line and discredited it. And I think that's what you need to see happen here. But it's just been interesting seeing this and the fact that it's got traction amongst these people who are very distrustful, that hate the U.S. government, that believe the U.S. government is a force of evil, running with it. The far right running with it because it embarrasses Biden. And this is the anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia side of the American right as well. So it's just been interesting to see that in real time over the last month turn into what's going to be, I think, a long-lasting conspiracy theory.
I don't know. I mean, my mind goes both ways to the points you made. One of the more interesting things I think that you said was the Google searches. But then I think of so many things where misinformation has spread and it just hasn't mattered, that are just as equally susceptible on Google searches, and really hasn't mattered at all what the mainstream media say. So I don't know. I
think it's when you go so long without addressing it or without countering it in a serious way.
I mean, those conspiracy theories about the vaccine, about 100 things about COVID were spread, and there was never any silence on the part of the mainstream media.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, there's certain things that are that big and that long lasting. This is more of your traditional Cold War sort of conspiracy, JFK assassination, like it's a singular event as opposed to a global pandemic that's having a material impact immediately on people's lives. So that's just going to always be a long-lasting, virulent sort of conspiracy theory. Sorry for the pun, but...
I mean, it seems to me the only people who are going to be interested in it are the people who already are watch Tucker Carlson to hear bad things about the government. And so the fact that, the majority of people have not come across the story,
the other thing,
be interested in it, even if they did come across it.
The other thing is, and this is important to note, we still don't know who did it. And it's not like the U.S. completely lacks motivation. Now, we tweeted out because I just wanted to put together my thoughts on it. But just from a pure strategic motivational issue, the risk of carrying out such an operation is completely disproportionate to what the U.S. could gain. But that being said, we don't know what is going to be the outcome of this investigation or whether it's revealed at all. And if it's never revealed, then for sure, this conspiracy theory just becomes one of those things maybe 30 years from now when it's the Freedom of Information Act and it's redacted. So I don't know what the status of, but this is the reason it's growing, is because you supposedly had this period where Sweden and Denmark are investigating, but there's been this radio silence for so long.
I don't know. I mean, possibly one of the reasons the media hasn't given it more attention is that there aren't any facts about who did not.
Yeah, but look, the surveillance balloon. I mean, we just had this past week where you had 3 other balloons that shot down. Was essentially the U.S. government is now hinting that these were commercial or academic purposes.
Which is what I said from the beginning.
But it was still covered.
That's impossible.
Some of these were shot over Canadian airspace, but my understanding is that you have to register anything that ends up in a commercial airspace or above that. You have to register the flight path with the FAA.
I told you they'd be commercial or research oriented.
Yeah.
And apparently that's quite possible.
But yeah, I don't see why that, I mean, that was a sort of a hysteria. So, right, exactly. this on the surface of it is much more because you're bombing infrastructure that was a critical energy resource more before the war for a NATO ally. And you're being alleged of conducting a conspiracy between two NATO governments against the interest of another NATO government.
So isn't the audience, though, it doesn't seem very impactful if it's Americans who believe this. Like, what is that going to change? There's a fringe people who believe in Jewish.
No, I think it's more the conversations being had
globally,
within Europe.
Right. So American mainstream media is not going to be targeting a European audience.
No, but
so you need
outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post have a global reach. And I think the fact that the Times of London covered it in such a nonchalant reaction way, as opposed to, I don't know a lot of global papers beyond the Washington Post and New York Times have the investigative capacity in order to debunk something. That's the thing about the shallowing out of the media in general, is there's only a limited number of global outlets that have the capacity and resources to carry out a hard-hitting piece that's needed in order to take this apart. Because right now it's being left up to amateurs. The people that, we'll provide show notes to, one guy he has a good reputation from the Ukraine war, but these are all open source that use open source data in order to make conclusions and things. And you can track, military boats and equipment and certain things and kind of debunk a lot of things. But the fact that it's being left up to amateurs and not huge outlets with huge reaches is concerning.
Yeah, that is a plausible argument. You're saying you need an authoritative voice to counter it. At the same time, you're saying there are no authoritative voices.
Well, I think just from the Google search, New York Times, you have enough articles like that that's going to crowd out any sort of searches around Nord Stream. That doesn't mean the people that, inherently believe it, but this is more so there's been a lot of speeches within parliaments around Europe, again, from either the far right or the far left, that are demanding their governments to investigate these things based on Hirsch's report. So that's a material impact that could, over time, lead to a fracturing of the NATO alliance, because you are seeing resonance within these governments of people pushing for it. You haven't seen that much here. You've only seen Mike Lee, who's a Trump nutball, talk about, well, if this is true, and I haven't heard anything, within my Senate committees to counter this, if it is true, then Biden should be impeached. But you see much more chatter in the various parliaments within Europe about it, and about the deafening silence within the mainstream media.
All right. Well, less entertaining, but important, was that this week the head of the World Bank, David Malpass, resigned following months of controversy when he denied the link between fossil fuels and climate change. Or more accurately, to say that he said he wasn't a scientist, so he couldn't say if he believed that link or not. The controversy, though, was several months ago, and so it was definitely still a surprise. The timing was a surprise, and no one quite understands it. It's important to probably note here that he was appointed the head of the World Bank by the Trump administration. That's probably why you have somebody who doesn't believe in the link between fossil fuels and climate change. So he was also criticized for moving too slowly to finance developing countries' shift toward low-carbon energy sources. And so this is thought to have been triggered by a greater push at this meeting and later at the COP27 meeting in Cairo by developing countries for both greater amounts of available climate financing and reparations for damages resulting from carbon emissions coming mostly from rich countries. So I found this latter point kind of interesting because I found it in some other articles about the fact that, you have 79% of the deaths from climate change are probably in Africa, while they represent 5 to 15% of all carbon emissions. So one of the reasons why I was interested in this story was because I think the World Bank is something that gets mentioned, but a lot of people I know from just talking to them don't really understand what the World Bank is. And this is important in the context of when we're always talking about Chinese investment and Chinese investment vehicles, to understand sort of what the standard vehicles have been. So it's one of the largest public development institutions in the world, with funding commitments totaling $59.5 billion in 2019. And In its own words, the main purpose of the bank is to assist in the reconstruction and development of territories of members by facilitating the investment of capital for productive purposes. So the main purpose of the bank is basically to lift communities out of poverty. And historically, it was an institution that played a very major role in rebuilding Europe after World War II. And it's gone on to target developing countries. Unlike IMF, the role of finance here is more lower interest and, again, more targeted specifically towards poverty. The World Bank also produces an amazing array of statistics on developing countries, undeveloped countries, on just an array of information you would need to understand their economies, their capacity of their states, their electricity consumption, things of that nature. So the members, as you would expect with the greatest financial contributions, have the greatest say, and the United States is the one who makes the largest contribution. So it gets to choose the president, which is traditionally a U.S. citizen. And obviously then, as we've seen with Trump, I hadn't really associated it with particular political personalities before, but then, of course, the presidential administration can make a difference. And most people think that there will be an emphasis on climate change from the Biden administration in who they choose to be president. So why even talk about climate change when it comes to poverty? Why is this important to developing countries? And there's several reasons why it is. It bears heaviest toll from climate change in terms of both deaths, where extreme climate happens is why you see so many droughts. Other concerns, the military names it as a top national security concern because when you have such poverty or you have weather destroying whole communities, such as through floods or other major storm damage or fires, then this leads to greater incidents of localized violence that can spill over into larger conflicts. It's estimated that in the last 2 decades, the cost to these countries has been in the range of $75 billion to $100 billion a year, which is really substantial, especially when you are talking about countries that are trying to lift themselves out of poverty. So there's a lot of frustrations now about how the World Bank goes about climate financing. It's been criticized for being unwilling to invest in renewable energy sources and projects. It's also been accused of being hypocritical, whereas the EU has decided that gas investments are sustainable for a transitional period, where in Africa, the same sort of logic projects are being blacklisted. And so countries want the World Bank to offer more in gas finance, and then, of course, in other projects that are less carbon intensive.
Yes, I think that's where the conflict is you have a lot of developing countries who are rightfully, looking to move up the economic ladder, bring electricity and energy to people that often, a lot of regions don't have it at all. And they're frustrated by the fact that, Europe, we talked about, has pursued a very aggressive policy, even the point of bringing on coal plants in order to deal with the lack of Russian gas from its markets, but has bid up and pursued a number of natural gas projects, which I think it rightfully sees as a transition fuel and certainly much better than coal-driven development. So it seems like the World Bank really needs to figure out, it's like, yeah, it should focus more on climate financing, but I think it should align with EU standards and determinants that natural gas is an acceptable form of transition fuel, certainly much preferable to coal, and that these projects should be included within that portfolio of energy projects that they consider.
Yeah, I didn't fully understand the part where those were banned from investments.
Yeah, essentially what they're criticizing is that no fossil fuel projects should be financed by the World Bank going forward. That was the push by climate activists in terms of some of these reforms that are being carried out. And it's not like I don't think it's a huge portion of the World Bank's energy projects and budget. They spent $6 billion over a 3-year period from 2018 to 2020.
It's almost nothing.
And they haven't financed any coal-driven plants for quite a time, maybe up to 10 years at this point. So they're certainly out of that side of the business. But I think when you look at what's realistic for these countries that have a high level of poverty, that want to bring better lives and amenities to their people, that you shouldn't take natural gas off of the table, especially in a place like Africa where they have huge oil resources and gas, in a place like Nigeria that had been vented for the longest time, so horrible methane emissions. But the fact that you can capture and develop more of that gas and have the financing in order to build the gas generators as opposed to not taking advantage of those resources.
I completely agree with you, of course. Something that people don't think about, why care about this climate change is not only in the cost to U.S. national security potentially, but that as these societies are growing, as they are trying to lift themselves from abject poverty, they need more energy to do that, right?
Absolutely,
This is the problem. So you're not financing energy projects at all. And mostly they have no choice but to turn to China, which has been more heavily investing in both the carbon side of energy projects as well as the greener side as well. They need to have these energy projects. And as I said, sort of when I was talking about the World Bank, one of the major indicators that we use of poverty is how much electricity do people have access to?
Yes, I think it's finding that right balance. And part of it is most estimates for kind of climate adaptation, it's not in the billions, it's in the trillions. So I know the Biden administration has pushed for additional funding of, I think, again, a fairly small amount, $11 billion a year, but that requires congressional approval and the likelihood of getting that. But when we talk about what are the institutions and ways to counter China, this is definitely one of the core ones. And I always forget that, China is a member too, and their contribution percentage. But in terms of a vehicle that can still advance these sort of interests, you have to be willing to put up the money for that financing too. And the other period of reform that they looked at is kind of that mix. Because when we talk about financing, the World Bank provides two different programs. One, for those that are not part of middle income countries, those are actually grants.
Yes, exactly. So that's different than the IMF, which is just loans.
Yeah, because the World Bank has kind of both programs, and more for the middle income countries where I think most will probably benefit more from the push around climate adaptation is places like India where that maybe need that additional incentive to, instead of building additional coal plants, to switch over to gas power plant. But again, you need that institutional flexibility. So don't cave in towards stuff that I don't think is necessarily fact driven around energy projects, but accept the already established EU definition of energy that natural gas is a transition fuel and it's vastly preferable to additional coal plants being installed.
And encouraging still, other...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
One thing that kind of struck me, because you had an article in our notes that talking about Chinese investment into energy projects in Africa and elsewhere, and they've been very interested, and this also includes Latin America, in countries that wanted to develop clean energy, allowing them to be able to sell their solar panels, their windmills.
Right.
And one of the reasons, one of the things that we complain about in not having that manufacturing capacity is not having the market to sell to. Obviously, also because China is making them cheaper, but it seems to me that that's also with all these subsidies that Biden is giving to some of these companies, that might be another way to grow that manufacturing base. I believe people are motivated for selfish reasons. So I guess that was a selfish reason. The U.S. might be also thinking about that more.
And I don't know the complexities of getting something like that when China is a significant member within the World Bank, but putting provisions in where, it's like, okay, we'll finance this project, or we'll provide a grant for this project, but essentially you have to do US or European made equipment for this project. Are those terms typically kind of laid out within a project?
No, and I don't think that's what I was
that's the way that you maybe would be more likely is like, okay, well, this is going to create so many thousand additional U.S. jobs if we approve this financing for...
But, the $11 billion that you were talking about Biden giving out, you could have those terms.
Well,
But
I
I
mean,
think it's a
again,
bit
it's that
complex
whole,
to
does
lay
it
it
go
out
into
that
a
way.
big pool where then it's judged by whatever the institution's internal rules are? I don't think you carve out what your specific contribution goes
Well, the
towards.
U.S. has its own development bank.
Right. So maybe for those sort of
Yeah.
project, yeah, you
But
can
I'm
have
not-
those
But just
stipulations.
talking through this, I'm not sure that's the best idea, but I still think maybe you could help manufacturing of Americans' own industry.
And sell it internally.
Yeah.
Instead of being framed as a giveaway to foreign nations.
Yeah, to sell it internally. I mean, one of the parts that we see that we need to be cost competitive, and so you'd be competitive with Chinese costs because of the subsidies, and then hopefully you gain the economies of scale, although I think it's actually difficult to make them profitable without subsidies. But if you are going to build that industry, encouraging those projects, you're at least competing for them.
Yeah.
And as I said, I think people respond to selfish reasons. So that's not the best reason to do this. But if you can find a reason to do it at all, it's better than nothing. And a lot of that would come also, as I said, particularly in Latin America. China is pursuing that. And why there are a lot of truly poor countries in Latin America. It also probably isn't targeting. I mean, I always think that the World Bank targeting the very least developed countries. I guess I always think of it more in terms of their loans plan. And there's just a lot of discussion, having taken a lot of political economy classes, whether that approach is effective or not. And it's just really, really hard to lift people out of poverty. But it's becoming even harder with climate change, and is one of the reasons why I think certainly you don't stop other programs that are necessary for poverty, but you're probably spending a lot of money or helping them spend a lot of money. I mean, if you're spending up to $100 billion a year together to adapt to climate change, but you're only like spending $16 billion on specific energy projects, then maybe that's not the most effective way to be using your money.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see who the Biden administration ends up appointing within this position, and then what reform measures, because I know that's certainly been an ongoing necessity for the World Bank to reform some of its institutional practices and standards. And yeah, hopefully we can push it in that direction of renewing these institutions to better offer different options to developing nations to counter China.
Yeah. I mean, counter poverty.
And alleviate poverty, of course.
I mean, it's always dangerous to say these things to counter China. But again, if we're thinking about selfish reasons, if that makes people
I'm
feel
always
better
thinking
about
how
it.
you sell this thing internally, because one side's going to frame this as the United States is $30 trillion in debt because we give all our money away to foreign countries.
When it's like
0.1% or what?
Yeah, it's less than 1% of our budget goes to any form of aid to other countries.
You would think it's trillions.
If you watch Fox News, I know.
Which millions do, as we covered.
I understand. And those people don't read the New York Times. Well, on to our very last part of the show, which is my interview with Bonnie Glaser at the German Marshall Fund. And I found it to be a really interesting and informative interview about many different aspects of U.S. and China relations. And so we talked about the more recent news of the Chinese spy balloons, talked about more generally about U.S.-China tensions and the relationship there, particularly those tensions over Taiwan and what the situation in the Taiwan Strait is. And then what conditions could China actually be motivated to risk war with the United States? And I find that interesting because I like to keep pointing out to people that it just doesn't make sense that China would jeopardize its economic system for a war with the United States over Taiwan or some other issue, because that's so core to the legitimacy of the Chinese party. But I think she made some points about possibly if Taiwan announced its independence or such, that could make this party worry about its continued regime survival. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, and I'm here with Bonnie Glaser, who is the managing director of the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific program and has worked at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and U.S. policy for more than 3 decades. She is also the host of the China Global podcast that covers China's foreign policy. I have found the episodes to be very interesting and informative, and I recommend that you check it out. There will be a link in the show notes. Hello, Bonnie. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
It's so great to have you here. So, to get straight into it, the biggest news lately has been the Chinese spy balloon. And many, including myself, are just baffled by the discovery of this balloon flying over the continental United States last week, since it completely contradicts the diplomatic overtures from China over the past few months. In fact, it disrupted the prospect of diplomatic progress on issues of mutual concern to the United States and China, with the Secretary of State Anthony Blinken postponing his scheduled trip to China without a firm commitment to be rescheduled. What is the possibility that President Xi did not know about the balloon and that it is instead the result of the internal dynamics of the Chinese government, such as a conflict between different interest groups or bureaucracies within the CCP? What do you think is the most likely explanation for the balloon's appearance at such a sensitive time in US-China relations?
Well, I think that's a really important question. And we need to understand China's intention behind the sending of balloons over the United States and the timing of this particular incident. So China's decision-making process is very different from the United States. There isn't a lot of interagency coordination. Sometimes the left hand just doesn't know what the right hand is doing. The Chinese military keeps a lot of information closely held and is not compelled to share it with the foreign ministry. So when US officials contacted the Chinese embassy in Washington, and this was, I believe, right when the balloon was sighted over Alaska, I think the Chinese embassy officials had no idea what the US was talking about. They had to go back and check with the foreign ministry, who probably also didn't know what the US was talking about, and then had to get information from the Chinese military. Now, the question of whether Xi Jinping knew about the balloon is also an important one. And my guess, just based on my understanding of decision-making in China, is that the balloon program, which was launched, it looks like at least 3 years ago, was likely approved by the Central Military Commission, and Xi Jinping is the chair. So he probably knew and approved the program. But that doesn't mean that he approved of or knew about every single launch that took place. And as far as we know, these balloons have now been flying over at least 40 countries. And as I said, it's been going on for several years. So Xi Jinping may not have known that this particular balloon was going over the United States at this moment in time. I don't think that the Chinese had any interest in trying to sabotage the planned trip by Secretary of State Blinken to China, because our two presidents, Biden, of course, and Xi Jinping, had met last November on the margins of the G20 in Bali, and they agreed to instruct their senior officials to meet and talk about how to stabilize the relationship and how to identify and pursue some areas of cooperation. The United States has been seeking to put a floor under the relationship. And I think that the Chinese also have an interest in stabilizing the relationship. Xi Jinping has a lot of domestic challenges, and there are signs that he would like to have a more stable international environment and is certainly a more predictable US-China relationship. So I don't think this came at a time that was really beneficial for China.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's sort of been some of my feelings on the issue too. What do you make of the Chinese response to the balloon, to us shooting down the balloon? Do you think it has in any way been productive toward what they want? Or do you think that this too has been a little bit misguided?
Well, China's initial reaction was that this was a weather balloon run by civilians and that really had no military capabilities. But we have since determined that that was false. And the US government flew a U-2 around the balloon before they shot it down. They got very good pictures. One of the descriptions was that underneath this incredibly large balloon was a package of electronics that is about 3 coach buses long. So there's a lot in there, including the ability to conduct eavesdropping, what we call signals intelligence, to listen in on conversations and to take various kinds of pictures. There was radar. So yes, it certainly had military implications. And I'm not surprised that the Chinese said that, but the fact that they were not truthful, I think, introduced greater difficulties in how this could be managed. And then when the US shot it down, yes, the Chinese were irritated. And they have demanded that the United States give back whatever they recover from the balloon. And that's unlikely to happen, but the Chinese probably made that request or demand because they recall that in 2001, when a Chinese fighter jet collided with a US surveillance plane that was then forced to land and did land successfully on Hainan Island in China, the United States demanded the return of the pieces of the return of the plane, which the Chinese then cut into pieces, put into boxes, and shipped back to the United States. But in this case, no, I don't think that the US is going to do that. So the explanations for China taking these positions, I think, are largely because they don't want to admit that they were spying. They probably thought that they could continue to get away with this, which was not a good calculation. But let's remember, they've been flying these balloons now around the world, including over the United States. Hawaii and Guam are two parts of the US that have been cited as places where the balloon has flown over in the past, and nobody has responded. The US government or, frankly, any other country. No one has complained to the Chinese. So they probably did think that they could get away with this, but they were caught with their hand in the cookie jar. So now the Chinese are speaking, of course, not only to the United States and the world, but let's remember that they are talking about this to their own domestic audience. And I don't think Xi Jinping can look weak on any issue that pertains to protecting China's national security, its sovereignty interest, and Xi Jinping does not want to look weak in the face of US pressure. So this is going to be a difficult incident to resolve. I think it will be resolved, but it will take time. So this planned visit by Secretary of State Blinken to China, I think, is not going to be rescheduled very soon, but I think will happen before the end of the year.
Right. So that kind of anticipated the next question that I was going to ask about how temporary the status may be. Also, you were talking about President Xi cannot look weak. President Biden has some of the same issues. There's been a lot of bipartisan outrage, and it seems to kind of constrained President Biden's to negotiate on issues like climate change. You mentioned that you thought by the end of the year, sometime they would resume some negotiations. So you believe there is this possibility of creating the floor and finding some cooperation between the US and China.
Well, I do think that the presidents, as I said, both agreed when they met last year, they would try to stabilize this relationship. And they specifically agreed to instruct their officials to discuss principles to guide the relationship. And in fact, just a few months ago, I believe it was in December, we did have some officials meet. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, Dan Crittenbrink, and Senior Director for China and Taiwan at the National Security Council, Laura Rosenberger, went to China and met with Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng and his team, and they did have a lengthy discussion about the bilateral relationship and possible ways forward, including the potential to agree on principles. I don't think they made a lot of progress, but of course, the next opportunity to continue that conversation was Tony Blinken's visit to Beijing. Later this year, in November, the United States is hosting what we call the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, and that will be in San Francisco, probably in November, and Xi Jinping is likely to come. And I think in the run-up to that visit, that there is an incentive and a desire on both sides to try and make some progress. And then our two presidents can meet and they can continue to advance the ball a bit. Nobody should expect huge progress. We're not going to see leaps, but we could see some baby steps. And one of the things that the Biden administration has been pushing since the very beginning is a discussion with China on what's been referred to as guardrails to prevent the relationship from veering into conflict. The US wants to manage the competition that we inevitably are going to have with China in the coming years. That competition is intensifying, but it doesn't serve the interests of either country to have a war. So talking about ways that we can prevent accidents, we can reduce risk between our two militaries and find areas to cooperate on that might help to build some habits of working together that can help to ease some of this mistrust in the relationship. And some of these issues that we should cooperate on, of course, are global. They're not just bilateral. You mentioned climate change. There's also global health. I think everybody would like to avoid another pandemic. There's issues that relate to counter narcotics trafficking. The US believes that the fentanyl crisis in the United States is in part due to some of the activity of the fentanyl production in China, or some of the chemicals that China is then sending to Mexico. So that's just some of the issues. And then there's North Korea and Iran that I know were on Secretary of State Blinken's agenda to talk about, and managing our differences over Taiwan and preventing war there is a really crucial discussion that we need to have.
Yeah, so I wanted to move on to Taiwan. So that was a perfect transition. As you probably know, recently a 4-star US general predicted a war with China in 2025. But he's also certainly not alone in the military in thinking that the US will go to war with China over Taiwan within the next 5 years. So what is your assessment of these feelings that have been expressed? And also, can you share your thoughts on the current situation in the Taiwan Strait?
That's a big topic, so I will try to cover it briefly. First, I would say that the US has apparently sufficient information to have concluded, and I don't have access to this information, so I do accept it at face value, although I wish I knew more. But they claim that Xi Jinping has instructed the Chinese military to be ready, capable of seizing and controlling Taiwan by 2027. There is no evidence, I've been told, that Xi Jinping has made a decision he will use force, or that is any kind of a hard deadline. In other words, reunification for Beijing is and has always been a historical mission for the Chinese Communist Party. If you read what Xi Jinping has said, he says reunification is inevitable, it must take place. He has also said that it is a requirement for national rejuvenation. Xi Jinping has labeled this goal of national rejuvenation the Chinese dream. And he has attached a target date to it, but not 2027. It's the middle of the century. That's the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China in 2049. And some people don't even accept that that's really a deadline. But by the way, Xi Jinping will be 95 that year. And it's highly unlikely, at least according to actuarial tables, that he will be in power that year. So people debate whether or not there's urgency for Xi Jinping to achieve unification while he is in power, maybe even during this 5-year term. And that 5-year term just started at the end of last year. So we have until 2027. But I think that Xi Jinping has a lot of other issues on his plate. Many of them are domestic. It's the economy, the demographic challenges that China faces. And I don't think that China wants a war with the United States. And by the way, the PLA, I think, is fairly certain that if they attack Taiwan, that the United States will be involved in a conflict. We will likely come to Taiwan's defense. So the Chinese have not abandoned using other means to achieve unification. And I think there isn't enough attention paid to those. The Chinese talk about peaceful reunification, but their definition of peaceful includes what we would call non-peaceful means. It's a lot of coercion. It's diplomatic pressure. The Chinese have seized I believe it's 8 of Taiwan's diplomatic allies, or the countries that recognize what is they formally call themselves the Republic of China. Since President Tsai came to power, that's Taiwan's president, in 2016. And they are left with only 15 countries that do recognize the Republic of China as an independent sovereign state. So that's a diplomatic pressure. And then there's military pressure. And we had the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, prior House Speaker, visit Taiwan last August. There was quite a display of military force around Taiwan, including a demonstration of the ability to implement a blockade around Taiwan and prevent ships and aircraft from going in and out. So in addition to that, we have economic pressure. The Chinese are now banning some products that they used to import from Taiwan. And then you have disinformation and cyber attacks going along with all of this. So there's a lot of, I would call it a very expansive toolbox that China has to pressure Taiwan, to instill a sense of despair that they can never achieve independence, that the best path for them is integration with the People's Republic of China. So China hopes they'll surrender. And I don't think they've given up on that part of their strategy. At the end of the day, however, if they do abandon that strategy, if they believe it's no longer feasible, if they think Taiwan is pursuing independence and they see signs of that, or if they think that the United States is emboldening Taiwan to pursue independence and is ready to recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign state. And just last week, we had a resolution tabled by 18 Republicans who think we should recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign state. So I suppose you could say that's not completely out of the realm of the possible. If all of those happened, yes, I think China would invade even if it was not ready, if it didn't have confidence that it had the capabilities to do so. But my bottom line is that this is an interactive dynamic. It's what the actions that Taiwan takes matters. If Taiwan is provocative, it could cause a war. If U.S. policy returns to having something like a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, which, by the way, we abrogated. We had one from 1954 to 1979. We abrogated that treaty as part of the understanding when we normalized relations with China in 1979. So we're looking like we're returning to that, certainly could provoke a Chinese attack on Taiwan. So we could manage this issue, or we could sleepwalk into a war.
That's very informative. One of the things that has always puzzled me in this discussion, would China really be willing to hurt its economy so much that a war would involve? Because, of course, the economies are intertwined. China's very integrated into the world system. So it's always been sort of a puzzle to me that they would make that decision and that they would undermine some of one of their strongest claims to power, which is providing these economic goods and prosperity to the Chinese people in exchange for them having any political freedom.
I agree with you that China does not want to invade Taiwan unless they have to, because it would have enormous negative consequences for China in terms of many things: its economy, its relationship with many countries around the world. There are countries now that are trying to manage the U.S.-China competition and don't want to choose sides, that probably would choose sides with the United States if China actually used force. China has not used force in any major way since 1979 when it went to war with Vietnam. So it has been a long time. And I think there's countries around China's periphery that are fearful that China might actually return to using force and do so in a way that would be far more consequential because its military is far more capable than it was half a century ago. But that said, the important factor here, I think, to understand is that Taiwan is a legitimacy issue for the Chinese Communist Party. So if Taiwan actually separates from China, and if that separation is supported by the United States, the threat to the legitimacy of Chinese Communist Party rule is fairly significant. And that might cause a risk to Xi Jinping himself and weaken his position and might even threaten the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to continue to be in power. So if the Chinese were to think that there is this independence prospect for Taiwan that they cannot prevent except by going to war, then they will put their economy and their other interests at risk in order to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, in the sense that if they felt like their power was in jeopardy, then they would be willing to risk all these negative consequences. Another way of thinking about the potential for conflict is an argument gaining traction in Washington known as peak China, which is an idea asserted by Hal Brands and Michael Beckley that says China is facing demographic and economic challenges that will halt its ascent in the next few years without it being able to replace or challenge the US as a global or even regional superpower. They argue that this makes China particularly dangerous right now, as it may engage in conflicts that it has a low chance of winning in order to preserve its relative power position. And they make analogies to Germany in 1914 and Japan in 1941. What do you make of this argument? And what do you think are the biggest challenges facing the Chinese government over the next few years?
As somebody who has followed debates about China for several decades, although maybe the term peak China is new, the idea that China faces challenges, vulnerabilities, might not ever surmount the middle income trap, might not become a strong power, might not be able to become the biggest economy in the world. That argument has been made before. And it has usually triggered a discussion about what are the risks of weaknesses in China. So if China's economy were to collapse, what would be the implications for the rest of the world? That's highly unlikely, by the way, but it certainly is possible that China has seen the best days of its rapid double-digit growth and will likely, I think all economists agree, will likely grow at a much limited pace going forward. Some economists would say 2 to 3%. This year will be an exception because China's coming out of COVID, and so it probably will grow at something like 6%. But some people even think that we may see negative growth in China. And remarkably, China's population has now begun to contract, which everybody, I think, has predicted, but is happening years before we expected that it would begin. So, yes, we have to be aware of what the implications are of something like peak China or China's economic slowdown, at least. But I don't think that a China that is growing more slowly or perhaps not growing at all necessarily makes China more dangerous. And that's the part of the Hal Brands, Michael Beckley thesis that I think is most controversial. Most of the historical examples, if you look at China's history, when it has encountered difficulties domestically, it turns inward. It has not used force in order to rally its population to support the leadership and the Communist Party. So I don't think that I don't rule it out, but I just don't think that that is the most likely outcome. China might use tougher rhetoric. We all read about China's wolf warrior diplomacy, so that could continue. They could use sort of small scale aggressive measures in places like the South China Sea. They can conduct more military exercises around Taiwan. But the idea that the Chinese Communist Party would choose to invade Taiwan at a time of great weakness internally because it's facing peak China, to me is one of the most riskiest things that they could do. I think it would be more likely that they would try to stabilize the situation with Taiwan as they focus on trying to reinvigorate their economy, come up with ways to be competitive, to become a leader in innovation. I think that's the way Xi Jinping thinks about this. I think he would rather not invade Taiwan in the near term. So this connection between peak China and becoming more externally dangerous, to me, is just not proved.
I completely agree. So, in the second part of that question, what do you think the biggest challenges that the Chinese government face over the next few years? You mentioned how its population is shrinking. Are there other challenges that you see that pose problems to President Xi and the Chinese government?
Well, I think their economic model is probably the biggest problem there. So we shouldn't limit it to growth. Their entire model, which delivered incredible growth for so many years, really is not going to work any longer. And now they have higher labor costs and they have relied very heavily on exports. So they need to become more consumer driven. Their growth needs to be driven more by consumption at home. And they, I think, have struggled to achieve that, although they recognize that that's what they need to do. So creating a new economic model that is successful for them, I think, is the biggest challenge that the Chinese government faces. And then there are things like debt within the system that needs to be dealt with. They have a lack of a social security type net for people who, as they get older, they have an inadequate healthcare system, which has certainly been demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And when they ripped the Band-Aid off and stopped their zero COVID policy abruptly, almost overnight, it was clear that the cases were already surging, but they don't have the healthcare infrastructure to cope with that. They have a gap between the rural areas and the urban areas that I think they have to deal with. They still need to improve their educational system. There are many faces of China, some of which are very advanced, some of which are just very, very backward. So the biggest challenge is really just to make China into a truly modern country in every definition of the term. And this is one of the reasons why China continues to call itself a developing country. Per capita income in China today is just over about $10,000. And so again, whether or not China can get through the middle income trap remains a big question.
Yeah, I find all those points interesting and definitely agree with much of it. Going back to Taiwan just for a moment, Taiwan has been increasingly militarized by both China and the United States. What do you think the countries need to be doing right now to prevent an accidental escalation of some sort of possible clash?
Well, I'm probably more concerned about a clash between Taiwan's forces and China's forces than I am between the U.S. and China in the Taiwan Strait. There is the possibility that China could fly inside the territorial airspace of Taiwan, which they have not done. But if, for example, the new Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has said he will go to Taiwan this year, and it is possible that China will want to up the ante and do something they haven't done before. And if they choose to fly within Taiwan's territorial airspace, which is 12 nautical miles around Taiwan, the Taiwan Air Force has been told that it can essentially fire first. That's new. In the past, Taiwan's military, their rules of engagement was to never fire first. So I think that there is an increased risk of an accident or incident between Taiwanese and Chinese air forces. The United States and China certainly could have an accident similar to what we had in 2001 between the U.S. reconnaissance plane and the Chinese fighter jet. And perhaps there could be an incident between our ships. So we need to have talks about how to avoid these incidents. We already have agreements in place since, I believe, 2014, but they're not adequate. And I think we do need to try to find a way to have more crisis communications. This is very difficult because of China's political system. We have the mechanisms in place. It's not a technical unwillingness of the Chinese to answer the phone in a crisis because nobody's authorized to talk to the United States in a crisis. So those are areas where I think we should be paying attention to. And of course, the U.S. government is quite aware of the urgency of making progress on those issues, but getting the Chinese to agree is another set of challenges.
Switching a bit, to accomplish many of the Biden administration's goals regarding China, the U.S. needs the cooperation of allies. Yet, many of the allies do not see China as the same level of strategic threat as the United States does. For example, while they share security concerns over Chinese technology, many of our European partners see their economic interest as diverging from the United States. This is evident in the recent trip of German Chancellor Scholz to China and the upcoming trip by French President Macron. Does the U.S. need to do more to build consensus with its allies, and how can it do so?
Well, first, I think that the conversation in Europe has moved a lot in recent years. So I agree with you that perhaps all of our allies, and particularly those in Europe, are not completely on the same page as the United States in our assessment of the urgency of the threat. Nonetheless, it's clear to me that most governments in Europe and really in Asia as well are increasingly concerned about China's ambitions and how that might affect their interests. The question is, what price are governments willing to pay on the economic front? And that's an ongoing conversation with the United States. And of course, last October, the Biden administration did impose some restrictions on exports to China in the area of semiconductors, and communicated that to our allies in advance, but then opened discussions with various governments. And there's a very small number of countries that have companies that are key in the supply chain for semiconductors. So this primarily affected the Netherlands and Japan and, of course, Taiwan. And over time, it took just a few months, and the United States has announced that we've essentially come to an understanding with those governments, although the specifics have not been made public yet. And these governments have to develop their own that enable them to implement the export controls that they have now agreed to pursue. And that will take time. But yes, companies, particularly in Germany and in the automobile and chemical sectors, they have been extremely successful in China, and that has helped drive the German economy. But we have individuals in Germany who are in the coalition government who have been warning against the excessive risk that Germany faces because of its over-reliance on the Chinese economy, on trade with China and the German export machine. So therefore, this is a work in progress. We are probably never going to be 100% on the same page. Germany or France or other European countries, and probably not with Japan and South Korea either. But I think that the gap is narrowing. Everybody wants to de-risk. The pandemic taught a lesson to countries around the world about the risks of over-dependence on China for medical supplies and devices. That was, I think, alarming to many countries, including the United States, that we had to rely on China. And there was one point I recall President Trump telling people in his administration, basically, let's hold off on criticizing China because we have to get medical supplies from them. This is not a good position for any government to be in. So this is going to take time, but I think that the United States is making progress with our European partners and our Asian allies as well, in large part because of China's own behavior. And Europe has come to see that what happens in the Indo-Pacific region, including the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, would have profoundly negative implications for their interests. There was recently a study that the Rhodium Group in New York put out, and they make a set of assumptions clear, but they say that if there were just a blockade, a Chinese blockade around Taiwan, no use of force, nothing kinetic, that the annual impact or cost to the global economy would be $2.5 trillion, which is far higher than costs that the world is paying for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think that's a wake-up call for countries around the world and will incentivize countries to do more to prevent that from taking place.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and providing this comprehensive overview of China and U.S. policy. I really appreciate it. I've loved having a chance to talk with you and learn so much from you.
Well, thanks for having me on as your guest.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter @GlobalKellogg or me, AR Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email, so Anita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see the show notes for all the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like the show, please take time to tell your friends and share it on your social sites. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.